coffee, big cup, and hello. Welcome back to another episode of the Gilmore Way Podcast. I'm Laura.
And I'm Kate. And since this is my birthday week, I've decided to schedule an episode to talk about two of my favorite shows, Gilmore Girls and Ted Lasso. It's the unexpected crossover you never saw coming and didn't know you needed until right now. At first blush, these shows have, nothing in common. They're totally different. How can a sports comedy about a Premier League football team have anything in common with a show about a mother and daughter in Connecticut who enjoy various aspects of certain sporting endeavors? But I actually think there's a lot of interesting points of intersection to talk about. As much as I love Gilmore Girls, I think Ted Lasso is one of the best dramedies ever made, and comparing the two informs a lot of my feelings about Gilmore Girls now in retrospect, so I really wanted to dig into that. Laura, you are newer to Ted Lasso and have just finished watching it for the first time. And would you say that you agree that there's actually a lot of overlap between these two very different shows? And how did you feel about it overall in light of watching it against Gilmore? We haven't talked about Ted Lasso in a while either. So I'm give me your high level thoughts.
Yeah, without disclosing any spoilers just yet, we will get into them as we continue to unpack, the similarities between the two of these. But yes, there were a lot more of them than I ever envisioned for a show that is about, Premier League soccer and a show about a mother and daughter in, middle of nowhere, Connecticut, as much as we all love Stars Hollow. Come on. It is what it is. But I saw a lot of parallels between the characters in terms of their arcs, in terms of privilege and how they approach society and how they view the world. A lot of problematic characters who were self-absorbed in ways that, again, are just way too one is the other. We'll get into that as well. There was a really heavy character focus between both shows while, not ignoring the plot, but giving time to, your B characters and your C characters and not just making it all about the main person all the time, which was refreshing and enjoyable. And comparing it to Gilmore Girls, it just was a breath of fresh air. And I think it's maybe just because it was my first time watching it, so it's that feeling of just binging a show for the first time when you don't know what's coming and you don't know what to expect, and Gilmore Girls, it's so much now, you can just, you see it in your sleep sometimes. But Ted Lasso was just for every episode that came and presented a new, again, plot point or character arc, and just, implications about society and just, representation. And we've talked about that too. I was hounding you for the longest time to know about a certain character. But it was just really heartwarming and enlightening to experience for the first time. I loved it. And I am just so excited to just, discuss these two shows now and how they're the same, but also how they're very different as well, because I also noticed a lot of differences.
Yeah, I started watching the show last summer. I got 4 episodes in before I roped in my now fiance. I was like, Dan, you have to watch this show. And so we watched it together and then finished it last year when it ended. And then I made you watch it. And so that's how we're here. I was like, we have to talk about this on the pod. You need to watch this show. And so I'm glad that you finished it and that you loved it, because I think it's great.
Yep. Before we really dive into it, this is, your regular warning that this is a spoilers all podcast. So Gilmore Girls spoilers are fair game. All of Ted Lasso spoilers are fair game. We will be talking about both shows extensively. And if you could please do those YouTube things for us, please like this video, subscribe to our channel. It's one click. It really does help us out. And on a personal note, there is a new member of the TGW family. I recently took in a new fur baby this week who is currently sleeping, but will likely wake up during the course of this recording. So if you hear meows or, cat noises or just, playful banter in the background, that's what's up. So he might be on screen one of these days, but if you hear the noise, that's just what it is, folks.
Yeah. So excited to meet my fur godson. But yeah, the other thing I need to warn you about is there may be some profanity in this one. Ted Lasso is very heavy on profanity. England as a country is heavy on profanity. My fiance's English, it's worn off on me quite a bit. I'm already a potty mouth to begin with, but even my notes are just full of expletives. So it will speak out. So if you can't handle that, sorry, not sorry. Theoretically, we're all adults here. We're talking about a show that has quite a bit of it. So I can't do anything about that. But, if you've got small children around you while you're listening, maybe earmuffs, just a little bit earmuffs. And also, this is probably going to be a two-parter because that's how we roll now. The first part, we're going to look at more like the higher level comparisons between the show on like a meta level. And in the second part, we're going to look a little more specifically at character comparisons, our favorite moments, quotes, and pop culture reference overlap. So that's the roadmap from here. And if you stick around either at the end of this part or maybe the end of the next part, I was actually recently in Richmond. I don't know how well the camera's picking that up, but I have a mug. If you're listening audio only, it says Richmond, and it has his aviator glasses and his mustache. So I bought this in Richmond, just meters away from the pub they call the Crown and Anchor, but it's in real life called the Princess Head. So I've been there. I got some pictures. There will be more stories about London later in the podcast, but we have been talking for 6 minutes already and haven't really gotten into anything. So let's do that first. But yeah, so I'll just kick off, I guess, with like the first point of similarity that really jumped out at me, is that both of these shows are dramedies that center on like real people and issues with real people, like family problems, divorce, romantic competition, trauma, the way our parents impact us. And that's sort of like the crux of both shows.
Mm-hmm. It is, but I'm gonna counter by saying too, as much as that's a similarity, just from a financial perspective, I wish I would have seen more in Ted Lasso, like just their characters addressing the financial components to things, because Rebecca is obviously filthy rich. Ted had to uproot his life from America to, England to take on this job in this position where he didn't know if he was going to be successful. His friend and I don't know how you want to refer to this, assistant coach, Beard, came with him. These two men uprooted their lives with, no promise of success. And it doesn't seem like they're ever really well off. But I wish we would have seen in Ted Lasso, I guess, more of just a commentary on how stressful and how financially scary that can be to uproot your life in that way. We see it in Gilmore Girls. Obviously Lorelai contends a lot with just not having the money to do things. Maybe Ted had rainy day savings, but that was something that I wish we would have seen Ted Lasso, I think, touch a little bit more on.
Yeah. That is such a crux of Gilmore Girls, is that money component. It's obviously what brings Lorelai back into her parents' life. And both shows are sort of almost like fish out of water, but in very different ways. Like Ted, he goes to England not only to take a job, not only for financial gain, but he's also there to get the distance he needs from his relationship, to see what's really going on, right? Like there's more to his story than just like, I'm doing this kooky thing and I'm taking a big risk. So there's like that side of the financial question. Like there's questions of class and whatnot that Ted Lasso doesn't really touch on either. Like that's not really their main bone of contention. They do get political. In fact, that's a major difference, I would say, is Ted Lasso is more overtly political. It is a message show. Amy says she doesn't do message shows. Ted Lasso is one. It very much has a point of view and it has a perspective and a bias and really comes at every problem from that angle. And class is just one of those things that it kind of skips over, whereas it's at the crux of basically every conflict somehow in Gilmore Girls. Any non-relationship, well, even some relationship-based conflicts have class at the heart of them. So like that's a major thing. Rory's story, I think, is the fish out of water that we get from Gilmore Girls, which is her starting at a private school, having to acclimate to a new kind of academic culture that she's not used to. Ted has to get used to a literal new culture, both a new work culture and a new environmental culture, like where he is from the Midwest to London, like one of the largest metropolitan cities in the world. Very different environments, to say the least. And yeah, Rory just has to sort of adapt. And we see her struggle to adapt in the first couple of episodes, but she starts to gain the respect and admiration of her teachers and her peers in a similar way. Maybe a lesser way, I feel like. And it's not the heart of her story the way it is for Ted, but like starting to make friends and start to make an impact and be a part of something in a way that maybe she wasn't at Stars Hollow. So a little bit tenuous, but it's there.
Yeah, but there's still a lot of overlap too with how a lot of our characters in the Gilmore Girls universe and in Ted Lasso have to confront relationships. And, there's definitely like a lot of dissimilarities with like class and how each show approaches it. But there's a lot of similarities with just broken relationships and things not ending well and mistakes being made by, several different partners and just the heartbreak of what it can mean when those relationships fall apart as well. In Gilmore Girls, I would say they keep it kind of like almost PG in a way where it's like, breakups can happen, and it's sad and, you'll have some ice cream, and then maybe get over it tomorrow. I loved how Ted Lasso kind of just, upped its game with that, as if to say like, listen, that's not how it works. You're not just going to have a pint of Ben and Jerry's and be okay the next day. A lot of the times, like the grief process with, marriages failing and relationships ending is just enormously significant, and it can have very weighty lifelong impacts. And I love that Ted Lasso addressed that, didn't shy away from it, and highlighted it as if to say like, these characters are really going to struggle because of these failed relationships. And Ted is the most prominent example of that. But I love that they highlighted that, and that, in the aftermath of his marriage falling apart, that they showed him having to deal with the after effects of it, and how he needed and was able to lean on the people around him to try and support him and get him through that. And it was obviously a very painful and impactful thing, but that's really just, I think, a very strong takeaway for Ted Lasso was that they addressed the truthfulness to what is a reality for so many.
Yeah. Yeah, the relationships, but it's got a lot to it. The divorce thing obviously makes me think of Lorelai and Christopher, and how they were never married in the first place, and yet they seemingly had all this trouble co-parenting. Like, co-parenting wasn't even an option for them. It was like Lorelai and Marie against the world. Christopher was just left out of it entirely. Whereas I loved seeing Michelle and Ted actively partner on raising Henry, and how Ted brought that up explicitly as a point during their breakups. Like he said, we have to be a team for this little boy. I just, that was so perfect. And, holding each other to account and keeping each other in the loop as part of co-parenting, which we never see with Lorelai and Chris, or Chris and Sherry, or anything like that. So that was a refreshing take. And the fact that the divorce wasn't a melodramatic fight or whatever, but it was just, unfortunately, watching two people fall out of love and realizing that they're, as much as they love each other and still have great affection and respect for each other, that their relationship is no longer tenable. And it's not just because Ted's in London. There's deeper reasons in terms of Michelle's emotional state, and how she relates to Ted in that way, and just can't keep up with his unending positivity. So I see some comparisons to Chris and Lorelai, who also didn't. There's a little melodrama in there. It's not as much, but they were fairly calm at the very least. I was gonna say mature, but I was like, no, that's not the right word. But at least they sat there and they talked to each other. And Lorelai tells Chris, "You're the man I want to want," which almost feels like Michelle saying like, I really wish that I still loved you the way that I used to, or like the sentiment of like, I'm going to keep trying because, we have all this history and all this built up and all of that. It almost feels similar, but with slightly opposite feelings where, Michelle and Ted had spent years building that relationship and raising Henry, whereas Lorelai and Christopher, whatever they did for 25 years, was nowhere near the level of intimacy and life that Ted and Michelle had going. And they were married for like 3 months before it was just like, I wish I wanted you, after a very dramatic breakup from Luke and everything. And so I really like that Ted Lasso sort of portrayed this really, like, it's unfortunate and it's heartbreaking. That scene and that song lives rent free in my head. That Mumford and Sons song. Oh God. Like, but it was so well done. It hurts, but it's the right thing to do. And I mean, it's the same with Lorelai and Chris. Like, that they're not meant to be a long game, but Ted Lasso was better there, at least on that front. Obviously there are numerous points of comparison, but that one for me, like, Ted Lasso wins.
Yeah, I agree. And it's telling too that, when Michelle comes to Ted and says like, listen, I'm going to keep trying. I'm sorry. I know the spark just isn't there anymore, but I'm trying to like, rejuvenate some sort of fire and make this work. And good on Ted, like, as brutal and as hard as I know that had to have been in that moment. But like, I applaud Ted for just being like, listen, you don't have to anymore, because it's not going to be good for you. It's not going to be good for us. It's not that we're throwing in the towel because we don't want to try, but sometimes it's just healthy to realize like, we can't continue to do this to one another because it just needs to be over. And I think Ted was always able to recognize that about his own marriage. Lorelai could never really do that with a lot of her relationships. And Rory too. I think both of our Gilmore women were just always so hung up sometimes on trying to make something work, even when it wasn't going to be healthy for both parties involved anymore. And so I'll give the point to Ted Lasso here for that. Like, it was just a much more healthy representation of how not every relationship is going to work. Not every marriage is going to work. And that's okay.
Yeah. It's just such a lovely episode. It's hard to watch, but it's so great. And I love what Michelle says to him, saying, you're not quitting this. You're just letting me go. And it completely reframes his feelings around this, because he has a sign in his office that says, winners never quit and quitters never win. And it's just his whole, like, part of his whole ethos is like, I promised myself I would never quit anything, which comes out of the situation with his dad, who, unfortunately decided to end his own life. Right. And that so deeply impacted Ted that he's like, I will never give up. And there's a difference between giving up and letting go. And so that's certainly a theme that the show plays with, letting things go, which the Gilmore Girls are not good at. Nothing in Gilmore Girls is ever let go. It's just 7 years of rehashing the same old things. Look at Friday Night's All Right for Fighting. It is a literal 10-minute montage of them rehashing the entire show and their relationships for the last 20 years. Whereas Ted Lasso, every character actually moves forward.
Mm-hmm. I'll never not love that montage, though. I think that is one of the strongest scenes to ever come out of Gilmore Girls. We've talked about it. Spectacularly written, spectacularly shot. It's just like watching the Real Housewives of like Gilmore, Connecticut, and I'm always going to be here for that.
Yeah.
But I will say, what I love about Ted Lasso is how when Ted is struggling, when Coach Beard is struggling, when any of our characters are struggling, they pretty much always have like a really healthy and present support system around them. And it's not just one person that they're falling back on. That was a very noticeable departure from Gilmore Girls for me, where when Lorelai is struggling, she just goes to Rory. And when Rory is struggling, she just goes to Lorelai. And they kind of just, my mom or my daughter will help me through this. I don't need anybody else. And
yeah, they're the sinking Loreleis for that reason.
Yeah. But in Ted Lasso, again, no matter who is struggling, and we see a lot of our characters struggling, it's not just Ted and Coach Beard, it's Keeley, it's Roy, it's Jamie. A lot of our characters go up against some really heavy things in this show, and they're always able to fall back on not just one person, but a collective group of people who are just always there and present for one another. And I love seeing that. I mean, you can highlight that with the Diamond Dogs. You can highlight that with some really strong and impactful female friendships that we have within the show. But it was never just one person going to one other person and saying, like, you solely will help me through this. It was just a collective, like, of calling of the banners when someone was struggling, and knowing that you're going to have, like, a handful of people who show up to help you through whatever you're going to, or even to listen to whatever grievances you have going on that day. And that was just really wonderful to see.
Yeah, it's sort of, it takes a village of it all for Ted Lasso. The team is the community, right? And that was Ted's whole purpose, was to unite the team and create a culture of support and understanding and safety with each other. And by the end, spoiler alert, he succeeds in spectacular fashion. He really is able to get through to these people. Rebecca starts out completely in opposition to him. That's the whole premise of this, is that she is setting him up to fail. And yet he very quickly wins her over and starts to uncover her compassion that we hadn't seen yet. And we start seeing layers to these characters that we hadn't before. And, Gilmore Girls similarly has characters with a number of layers and who are willing to be part of that community and to show compassion to others. And so, both are very much centered on that sort of like found family, community emphasis, that, and like that community being like making a place special, again, spoilers for the very end of Ted Lasso, but, Ted says something along the lines of, people say there's no place like home, but man, there ain't a lot of places like AFC Richmond either. And I think that's kind of also true for Stars Hollow. There aren't a lot of places like Stars Hollow. And that to me is kind of a point of comparison.
Mm-hmm. Well, I have to ask you a question following up on that. Which would you say was the stronger community and the stronger support network? Stars Hollow as a town or AFC Richmond as a team?
I think by the end, AFC Richmond wins that too, because it's just so much more like unified, and there's a reason for them to like really be together all the time and to work together as a team. You get town meetings and town events and stuff, but like not everybody participates in the same way as Lorelai and Taylor and Kirk and Patty and even Babette, right? But at AFC Richmond, that is a well-oiled machine of people who know how to work together. Like that's the whole point of season 3 with the total football thing, is, the adaptability of players being able to recognize what needs to happen at any given moment and fill that role. And so you see the characters really start to grow and adapt. And like, I feel like there's less of Ted in season 3 and there's more of other characters, because they're starting to take his lessons to heart and starting to do his job, if that makes sense. And that's exactly the point of a coach. They're not there to hold your hand through the whole thing. They're there to teach you the skills you need to get by. And while Stars Hollow is a really supportive community in general, and like they welcomed Lorelai and Rory with open arms, I don't know if any geographical town or community could ever hit that same level of culture as a sports team of any kind, football or otherwise, just because of the nature of sport and the connection that provides and the amount of trust you need to have in each other to make that work. And so I think at the end of the day, AFC Richmond wins there for me. So that's like Ted 2, Gilmore Girls 0.
Yeah. We'll keep score.
It's only fitting for a sports themed episode.
Yep. Extra minutes if necessary, which will probably happen because it's us. Anyhow.
Yeah, we're gonna go into stoppage time on this one, guys.
Yep. So we've deduced the similarities and differences between the show as it represents, communities supporting each other as a whole. But let's get a little bit more nuanced with how women support each other, within both shows. Gilmore Girls, it's in the title. Like, it's a mother and daughter who are always going to be there for one another at the end of the day. But it's not just Lorelai and Rory. It's also, Emily, believe it or not, Suki, Gypsy, Patty, Babette. There are a lot of really strong, female friendships that we see within Gilmore Girls. But we also see, I think, even stronger female friendships within Ted Lasso. Just friendships that blow, the Gilmore Girls, female friendships out of the water. Talk to me a little bit about that and the similarities that you saw there.
Yeah. It's ironic because by the nature of it being a show about a Premier League football team, so many of the characters are men. And yet some of the best and most memorable characters, most lovable characters are the women. Rebecca, Keely, Barbara. I quite like Barbara. Higgins' wife. I think her name's Marie. Could be wrong about that. Not so much Shandy. Shandy's a bit of a mess. Not a great friend. Just at the beginning, Rebecca is so cut off from everyone. She's just so living in her own little bubble of hatred and pain that she's cut out everyone, and the only people in her corner are people she's manipulating and blackmailing. But then Keely gets a good piece of advice from her and is like, I've decided I'm not going to be afraid of you anymore. You are no longer terrifying to me. I'm going to get over myself and come talk to you. And Rebecca is so taken aback by this that, I think she's charmed by this, and she's like, ooh, this is interesting. Okay. Someone's actually coming to me in a genuine manner and wants this kind of connection. And then later we see Keely still stepping up for Rebecca, in Liverpool, especially. That to me is a big turning point for Rebecca's character, obviously. And Keely's a big part of that. There's been a bit of a slow build, but now Keely and Rebecca are sharing a hotel room in Liverpool and hanging out with each other. And then we meet Sassy. I love Sassy. I want a Sassy spinoff. She's a child psychologist. Could you imagine that show, her and Nora, with guest appearances from Hannah Waddingham?
I would take a spinoff of just Nora too. Just saying.
I would take a spinoff of anything from the show. All of the characters deserve spinoff. But the introduction of Sassy really gives us more insight into Rebecca and why she's so isolated. And I love what she says to her outside the karaoke bar when they're having a smoke. And she's like, he's a jerk who built you an ivory tower and kept you isolated from everyone. But you climbed every step of that tower yourself, and you need to take responsibility for the role you played in that. And it was beautiful watching a woman hold a friend to account for crappy behavior and for ghosting on them for 5 years or 6 years, and not doing it in a confrontational way or a catty way. Or, if that had been a scenario on Gilmore Girls, I could imagine that being a little bit more of a bitch fight, frankly. But it was it was so mature for Sassy to be like, no, girl, you have to remember that you were a part of that you were the one who cut yourself off. You stopped coming home. You stopped visiting. You stopped calling. It wasn't just him. And so that was lovely. And the other thing I loved about Sassy in season 1 was how Rebecca and Sassy meet. And immediately it was just I love you. There was no animosity or catfighting or jealousy between them. It was just love.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, we don't get a ton of catfighting, but we do get a lot more girl on girl kind of drama in Gilmore Girls. There are more female characters. And so I think what they did with Ted Lasso was, even with a smaller cast of female characters, they focused on it and they gave us largely healthy relationships between them, instead of just being like, let's center women by making most of the characters women, but not really like interrogating their interactions with each other and deciding whether that's like the way that we should be representing women in relationship with each other.
Yeah.
That was a bit of a long...
No, but like I love the juxtaposition though, because I mean, and again, it could also stem from, you know, age factoring in, but look at, you know, the, you know, blossomings of Rory and Paris's friendship, you know, as they were at Chilton. And again, granted, they were teenagers, so, you know, it could come into play that they're a little bit younger, not as mature yet. But there was some boy contention, you know, with Tristan. I mean, I even think of the scene when they're in, you know, Headmaster Charleston's office, and, you know, they make the comment of like, oh, we could only be like, you know, fighting about a boy. Like, what else could it possibly be? You know, there wasn't that level of contention in Ted Lasso. It was more just, again, what I love about it and what I think is a breath of fresh air. It's like, let's not fight over men. Let's not fight over, you know, career paths and the jealousy of someone maybe being more successful than I am, or having a livelihood that I want but don't yet have. It was always just about supporting women, but also like A for accountability, which I think is just so strong and at the forefront of Ted Lasso. And I love it, and I'm here for it all day, because even in the early ongoings of, I don't know why I'm blanking on names right now, even with Keely's friendship, you know, one of the first things that she does is she confronts her, and she's just like, listen, you had a photographer take those photos of Ted in a sticky situation. You need to tell him that you did that. You need to own up to releasing those photos to the Sun and the press, and you need to apologize for that and tell him. And if you don't, I'm going to. And that was a really contentious start to the friendship. It could have, you know, led to the friendship ending, but it was just very instantaneous, where it's like, I appreciate you as a person. You know, I want this friendship to continue, but you did something shitty, and you need to own up to that right now and be accountable for it. It's not the only instance of it that we see in the show. You know, we could talk about a lot of those, and, you know, it comes up very often, even between, you know, when Keely gets into her relationship, and there's a video put out online that should probably have never been put out online, but now she needs to be accountable for that as well. There's just a lot of, you need to accept responsibility for the choices and the actions that you've made, apologize to the people that you've hurt for it, and try and be a better person for it. We get a lot of that out of Ted Lasso. In Gilmore Girls, it's a lot of, when our women are confronted with things that they have done wrong, it's like, how dare you? I am holier than thou on that pedestal. I have done nothing. It's the other party or the rest of the world that's at fault. It's never me that's at fault. And there's never that sort of acceptance of, I effed up, I need to accept that and apologize for it, and, you know, rectify that with the people that I've hurt and wronged. Stark difference. But again, point to Ted Lasso.
Yep. And that's 3-0 going into halftime. Yeah. And something that I actually didn't have in my notes, but it's just occurred to me, is that sort of generational difference too. I'm especially seeing it with the women, but it happens within the men as well. You know, Rebecca, I don't think we ever get like an actual age for her, but she's in her 40s, I would say. Keely's about 30. And so we have this sort of like mentorship, but they're not, like, there's not a huge power gap between them. They're friends and mentor-mentee. That they're able to balance those dynamics in a beautiful way. And then you get, like, another one of my favorite relationships is actually Keely and Phoebe. You know, like, her independent relationship with Roy's niece is just so cute and so sweet. The fact that, like, there are young girls on the show in a way that Gilmore didn't really have. You know, we had some very brief glimpses of like 4-year-old Gigi, and that's about it. But we have Phoebe, I think, is 6 when the show starts. And then there's also the little girl who's the daughter of the Flying Dutchman, essentially. I don't know if we ever got her name, but, you know, Rebecca's eventual like stepdaughter. And so we have these young girls, and then we have Nora in her teens, and Shannon as a teenager. We don't get a ton of her, but like she's just there enough where I'm like, Shannon, she's talking to Ted, and even as someone way younger than him, still has probably more knowledge about the sport of football than he'll ever have. So it's nice to see that these different like age gradients can interact and learn from each other, not just older to younger, but younger to older as well. So that's fun. But moving on a little bit, you obviously touched on sort of, I think, to me, the main difference, or like the biggest, most important difference between these shows, and that is accountability. Ted Lasso puts that front and center. It is explicit from episode 4 when Keely confronts Jamie at the benefit dinner and tells him that accountability matters. And then from then on out, you see every character being taken to task for their actions. Toxic characters are actually called out to work on themselves, and accountability and forgiveness are encouraged from top to bottom, beginning to end. And in Gilmore, like, can you remember any time a character actually took like real accountability for something that mattered in a meaningful way, where they actually confronted the hurt party and the conflict and came out on the other side a more mature person?
I'll wait.
Crickets.
Not in any sort of genuine capacity. I mean, sometimes I feel like we get half-assed apologies, like, "Oh, I'm sorry. Like, I didn't mean to do that. Like, let's just, I apologized. Everything's fine now." Not always. Some things take more than just, the words being thrown out there. Keely says it best, like, it does matter. Sometimes it's not about just saying, like, "I'm sorry." It's about showing, like, you can say it, but now what are you going to do to rectify this situation, to actually show that you're genuinely apologetic for the hurt and the pain that you've caused?
And what are you going to do to maintain trust and keep this up going forward and not continuously like relapse into this bad behavior? Like,
look at Ted Lasso. We hold a elementary school boy accountable for what he did to Phoebe for the bad breath incident. No one is, blameless here. Like, if you did something that's wrong, you're going to be called out on it. You need to make amends for it. In our Gilmore Girls universe, I don't think I can't think of offhand a genuine circumstance where someone was really, truly sorry for pain that they inflicted and pain that they've caused.
Yeah, it's more of a reflex of like I'm sorry, this is what I should say. But there's no like deeper contention with it or conversation around it. Like, the example that comes to mind for me is when Nate is railing at Ted at the end of season 2, and Ted says to him, like, "You're obviously really mad, and I need to know like what I did wrong so that I can do better," basically. And we never, ever get that with the character on Gilmore Girls. It's always just sort of like, "Oops, sorry I did that to you. Like, these were the mitigating factors, but like, sorry." And then we just move on and brush it under the rug and never like revisit it again. And Ted Lasso makes it a linchpin in character arcs. And the obvious example for me here is Jamie. He says sorry to Keely multiple times throughout. Like, anytime he like steps over the line even a little bit, he apologizes to Keely and often Roy. Like, when he tells Keely he loves her at Rebecca's dad's funeral. And he later goes to Roy and says, "I told Keely I loved her and I'm sorry." Like, that was a boss move. I have never seen that on television. And Ted Lasso went there and they killed it. And then by the end, so you alluded to the video leaks in season 3, that plot line. The video that she recorded was intended for Jamie and sent to Jamie. And it was his lack of like consideration of his digital security and having a very weak email password that led to that video getting out there, unfortunately, even though he deleted it off his phone. Lessons to all y'all. Strong passwords, and what you do on the internet lives forever. Remember that. That's how they're solving a lot of crimes these days. Stay alert. But in that moment, he goes to Keeley. This is like 2 years after their breakup, and he says sorry to her for something that, like, it was his fault, but it was not his fault. It was never his intention. It was not done with malice aforethought. It was just something unfortunate that happened as part of this larger problem, and he understood that Keeley was hurt by it. And he went to her with no reservations and, like, apologized with no strings. Just like, I'm sorry that this impacted you. And it shows that he took that to heart and he listened. And, you know, by the end, he's no longer the toxic F-boy that he was, that you love to hate in season 1. Like, I feel like I remember us watching it and you're like, man, this Jamie guy really sucks. But, like, did you not love the way he grew and, like, who he ended up being? Like, he's just the absolute best. And, you know, speaking of that and characters and the differences.
Oh, I know where you're going, but continue.
Okay, you think you know where I'm going. You might know where I'm going. The fact that Jamie actually got a character arc. He got to grow as a character. And we weren't just told, we were shown and not told what character growth looks like. Everybody says that Jess has a great growth arc in Gilmore Girls. And I'm like, oh, hold your horses, because Jamie Tart is how you do character growth from toxic masculine F-boy to, like, class A human being. And yeah, Jess makes some improvements, but they just sort of bring him back every 2 years or whatever to be like, look at how great he is. And yet they never tell us how he got that way. They never tell us what he's up to now. We don't know that he's not an F-boy down in Philly. Like, he's just like, I'm stable, nothing permanent. Like, how do we know he doesn't have, like, 3 girlfriends going on at once? Like, we're left to fill in these gaps. Whereas with Jamie, we watched a slow burn of him with numerous opportunities to step up and be a better person, and he took every single one of them. And when he faltered, he apologized and he learned from it and he moved on, and he continued to grow and grow and grow until he was one of the best characters on the show. He was like Sam Obisanya level by the end, and that is impressive. That is character work.
Yep. I'm just going to say, quick personal dig that I know you will get. If you're a nerd like we are, you might pick up on this as well. But isn't it really nice just to have a character named Jamie have a really just well-rounded and fleshed out character arc by the time the show ends, as opposed to just dumping on them and having them just, you know, flit off into the world and do themselves, you know, after years of build-up and no resolution. Just saying.
To, like, not have them go back to their twin sister.
You know, after, like, professing, you know, pretty much some really, you know, resolute love to a woman and then just misleading her along the way. Just saying. Another point to Ted Lasso, bringing in, you know, another just detriment to another show. But yeah, really nice to have a character named Jamie who by the end of the show actually has done work on himself, has become a better person, has become self-accountable and self-aware for the actions that have caused pain and hurt to others, and is a better person for it by the end of the day.
Also, another terrifying, beautiful, tall, blonde woman in Gwendolyn Christie. And again, on the Game of Thrones front, Hannah Waddingham was Septa Unella. Shame. So I love that.
The overlaps continue, folks.
Yeah, some people did not realize that she was the Septa meme for a while, but I clocked her immediately. I was like, oh yes. Yeah, no, people are like always talking about how Jess had the best character development on Gilmore Girls, and after watching Ted Lasso, I was like, you're wrong. Like, no, That's not character development. That's a cameo of, you know, someone bringing him in and being like, you know what, you're less of a douche now. How about that?
Yeah, because
That's all we
with
got.
with Gilmore Girls, it's like it's essentially you tell us that Jess is doing better, and like you have him show up for 5 minutes, and you basically just have the narrative of like, oh yeah, he's doing fine. He's got a better job now. He's growing as a person, and you tell us it, but you don't ever show it to us. And that's what Ted Lasso does really, really well. You don't just hear about Jamie becoming a better person, you see him becoming that better person, and you see that progression, and you see how we'll get to talking about this too, how Roy is such a positive investment in his life to help him have that forward movement and that progression, to being a better person. And by the end of the show, Jamie is even saying to Roy, like, I've never had such a positive older male, father figure or person in my life who has guided me in this way, who has helped me in the way that you have. Thank you for that. And again, just give another point to Ted Lasso here, where it's like, you don't just tell me that someone's doing better, you show me how they've gotten there.
Yeah, we actually got growth arcs for these characters. Some of them had, a pendulum swing from start to finish of like massive change and growth. And others had subtler changes. Like, they started out pretty good, but got even better. And obviously we had Nate who took a villainous turn, but even that, it was so well set up, and it was an arc with a distinct, beginning, middle, and end. At least, obviously, for the 3-season structure of the show. There's more on either side of that, obviously, but we actually got those arcs, whereas I feel like with the Gilmore Girls, they just sort of spent 7 years spinning their wheels. Like, I don't remember, like, massive change or growth in a super meaningful way for anyone. Like, they moved forward in their lives, but did they ever truly contend with what was holding them back? And did they ever meet their potential? Did they ever like take meaningful leaps forward? It's not as strong for me. Like, maybe if you look totally beginning to end, where Rory was this meek, shy, studious girl who opened up socially and got a lot of life experience and graduated from an Ivy League institution and like started living up to the expectations for her. Obviously, we see by the revival, some of that has been backtracked a little bit. But, it's not as distinct. And so therefore, to me, it's not as satisfying because we didn't necessarily get to watch this sort of like bit by bit progression. Maybe Luke gets a little bit of it, where he like starts out really gruff, and then you see him open up a little bit with Rachel, and then you see some hope for him and Lorelai. It takes a while to build, and then he does the self-help tapes thing. But again, that's a perfect example of why Gilmore was weaker at this than Ted Lasso, because Ted Lasso shows these distinct events and how the characters grow from it, and like actually have them continue that change. That behavior is changed. Whereas Luke reads one book and suddenly has an epiphany of like, I'm going after Lorelai now, and suddenly he's emotionally enlightened. No, he just reverts to being his old self, and he doesn't like have this sustainable change of behavior that's necessary for progression and growth.
Yeah, I agree. And that's why, again, just Ted Lasso does it better. I want to highlight a little bit about, I want to talk a little bit more about the men. We've talked about the women and how they can support one another. Ted Lasso highlights men supporting men really, really well. And I feel like there are so few shows out there that do it as strongly as Ted Lasso did. But it's such an important thing to bring up because, we talk about the whole concept of like wing women, and like, women supporting women. And when emotional, things come to the forefront and, we're contending with things, you need to have a shoulder to cry on. And I feel like we've done a little bit better with it, but society really equates that to like, it's okay for women to show emotion and to talk about their feelings, but how dare a man do that? And so when we get the introduction of the Diamond Dogs and that establishment of, this group of men just, saying like, I need to talk to you about my relationship, or I need to talk to you about like family issues, or, how my parents are making me feel lesser than, they're always there to support one another in that regard. Talk to me about how not only how Ted Lasso does that really, really well, but how Gilmore Girls could have done that better. Because we have male characters like, Luke and Jess who could have been reliant on one another, but really seemingly weren't. We have characters like Jackson where it's like, if he was ever struggling, who would he have gone to? If Richard was having a bad day, and you don't want to talk about your ish to Emily, who do you go to? Like, just how could Gilmore have done that better?
I don't know that I have any specific suggestions as to how Gilmore could have done anything differently. But just like listening to you talk about it, I'm like, the guys on Gilmore were so siloed. Whereas in Ted Lasso, they're very much like always in the same location physically. They're training together, they're practicing together, they share offices, they're all connected, right? Whereas the guys on Gilmore Girls are there kind of as accessories for the girls. Luke's at the diner. His relationship with Jess is strained by their living together. That's kind of like the one example that stands out as maybe an exception to that. Chris lives off in Boston. Jason is in Hartford. Richard and Emily have their own house. Like, these guys aren't interacting with each other and living with each other in the same way as the Ted Lasso guys are. And so there aren't as many opportunities to see that sort of like male bonding and to watch them be emotional and vulnerable with each other in the absence of a woman. And, Roy is a great example of a character who is very different with guys than he is with girls. And I feel like you maybe get some of that in Gilmore too, where like, look at Luke. He's a puddle around Lorelai, but he is basically a ranting lunatic with Taylor and Kirk and in public with a large group of people. And so it goes to show that like there are different facades that in general humans put on for other people. And unfortunately in our culture, masculinity dictates that the facade you have to put on needs to be dominant, aggressive, unemotional, rational, as if those two things can't be, coexisting. Just like, you can't show emotion, you can't connect, you can't be sentimental or earnest with another man, because that's girly. That makes you a word I don't even want to use on the internet. I think you know what I mean. Nate used it against Isaac in the locker room at Everton. Fill in the blanks. Just that sort of the male ideal of being, stoic, strong, silent type. It is something that some of the characters on both shows have to contend with, and Ted Lasso really dismantles that in so many ways. And they really take the opportunity to dig into why men are so emotionally constipated. It's just poopy.
I'm not even going to attempt to replicate any sort of accent right now.
That Mancunian accent alone should get Phil Dunster an Emmy. Seriously.
Yeah, not attempting. I will just embarrass myself, but top tier accent. Following up on that a little bit, and going and just bouncing off of the fact that, like, regardless of gender, you need to be able to feel like you can emote when you need to and be emotionally vulnerable. And that's what Ted Lasso presented with a lot of, the men in the show, which was, something so different from what we have seen in a lot of shows in the past. Sometimes, as good as it is to have the Diamond Dogs and to have, like, a friend network and a support network in that regard, sometimes you need help and assistance that goes beyond just a friend or a sibling or a parent. Sometimes you just need like actual professional help. We see that talked about on both shows. I think highlighted a lot more on Ted Lasso, and really obviously very much showcased in a more positive light where, in Gilmore Girls, just the thought of going to therapy or talking with somebody or seeing a psychiatrist was just like, oh, why are you nuts? Like, what's going on? Like, do you actually have like, should I be afraid? Like, what are there genuine problems? Yeah. But in Ted Lasso, it's like, no, this is actually a very healthy thing to be able to speak to somebody in a professional capacity about it. the fact that AFC Richmond, eventually brings in someone 24/7 to fill that role. Talk to me about how both shows confront just the idea and the concept of therapy, and how each show either just does it well or not well.
Right. Gilmore Girls is very scant on the references to therapy. There's a couple instances of Lorelai suggesting it to Emily as a way to, for Emily to have another outlet and someone who can give her some perspective and some maybe advice on how to deal with the changes in her relationship to Richard. Like when he retires and she's like having trouble with him being around all the time. And Lorelai suggests, hey, maybe Dad should go see a therapist because, this is a big life change for him. And he needs some help with that transition. And there have been other smaller instances, and Emily just brushes her off and it's just like, no, I'm not crazy. I'm not going to a psychiatrist. And then in the revival, we finally see them going to therapy together and very little progress is made. It's just sort of like hurling accusations at each other, quote unquote, comedically for way too long. And, it asks more questions than it answers, unfortunately. Whereas Dr. Sharon is a far more realistic portrayal of a therapist. Not everything is 100% accurate, but like she is far more, like she's far closer to what you'll actually get in a professional setting. They did a good job with the research for her and the way that she interacts with people and what she says to people, but they also make her funny at the same time. Carrie Butler was a punchline, and Dr. Sharon, well, we don't know what the therapist's name is, so I'm referring to her by her real name, whereas we get, obviously Dr. Sharon's a much more prominent character. So like, she's not a punchline, but she is funny. She's a human being with a sense of humor and sometimes a dark sense of humor because of the nature of her job. But Ted Lasso not only includes it, but actually embraces it. They make it a core part of, especially season 2, while Sharon is with them at first. And, in the beginning, it's all to help Danny Rojas get over the yips. Oops, I said the word. I did that thing. I've cursed AFC Richmond forever. Oopsie doopsie. And, sports psychology is its own complete subgenre from, general therapy. But, it's very clear that she makes an impact with several players early on. And Ted is obviously very skeptical because of his own personal issues in the past, specifically Dr. Jacob. By this point, he still doesn't know that Michelle is in a relationship with him, but he felt very persecuted in their sessions and felt like it was Michelle and him, like Michelle and Dr. Jacob versus him. And that was hard for him to contend with. And for someone who had role models who are always repressing things and were pretending that everything was okay, the idea of that kind of professional help and spilling your guts to someone who doesn't know you and paying for it and all of that, it seems antithetical, which is what you get in Gilmore Girls. You get this skepticism about it. And Ted's reticence is a little bit understandable given his personal history, whereas Emily is just like, no, that's not what we do here. Ted's mom is like that. When Ted asks her why she hasn't sought help, she said it's not her cup of tea. We don't know if she ever ended up getting it, but we know that Ted's further experiences with therapy were ultimately helpful to him. He was finally able to open up to and trust Dr. Fieldstone, and it really helped him work through the mental blocks he was having and the fears and the anxieties he was having. And it helped him achieve clarity about himself that he didn't yet have. He was so good at helping other people that, by the end of season 1, he's sort of like out of conflicts to resolve. Obviously they've been demoted, but that's not the same thing. The locker room is a much better place. Jamie is not there to make things toxic. The players are getting along better. But once that happens and there's no longer any like interpersonal conflict, then everybody has to start looking inside themselves. And that's when things start to go off the rails and characters start losing it. Ted's panic attacks get worse and Nate's self-esteem issues deepen and turn darker and get more insidious with his his spite, his bitterness, his self-hatred, his aggression, all of these things, his taking his feelings out on other people. And that's when Ted has to start contending with this stuff. And he actually does it. I love what the guy says to him. I don't know what YouTube's going to do. We're an hour into this. I'm hoping that they're not going to be like, this is a problem for the thing that, goes over the video before we even post it. But the guy who always walks through town and says, "Hey, wanker," that guy, after the panic attack stuff is announced and released, he says, "Hey, wanker, if my grandfather had a panic attack at Normandy, we'd all be speaking German now." But then he sort of turns back around and is just like, "Just do the work and you'll be fine." And I think that's a really poignant line. Just do the work and you'll be fine. And that's what therapy is about. It's about looking inside. It's about doing the work on yourself. It's about asking the hard questions. It's about being curious about yourself, but not judgmental. And, again, it fits beautifully into that whole philosophy that Ted has. It's a bit of a sticking point for him at first because he's skeptical. But eventually, he sort of, his whole thing is be curious and not judgmental. And yet he goes in being judgmental of this professional. Mm-hmm. And only when he starts actually asking questions and accepting her answers does he start to let that wall down a little bit. But just in general, the way that Ted Lasso included and approached therapy was just far and away. It should get 2 points for therapy alone.
2 points, yeah.
Yeah, and the fact that they made Dr. Sharon Fieldstone head of mental health and emotional well-being at the very end, and she has her own office with a placard and everything, that just speaks to, the belief, believe and believe, the belief that working on your mental health should never be something to be ashamed of. That struggling with it should never be something to be ashamed of. Gilmore Girls pushes it aside. They've got that New England stiff upper lip. They got that from regular England and they kept it. Just that sort of waspy pessimism and whatever that sort of attitude is. They don't have that Midwest optimism of Ted Lasso. But I love that they sort of broke that down and they approached mental health seriously and empathetically and realistically in a way that I've never seen a TV show do in general, but also is very important to the discussion of professional sports.
Yeah. And with Ted Lasso, just, kind of capping off everything that you just said, because I think you just said it so perfectly that I don't really have much more to add. It was also just very much a lead by example sort of thing where, I'm sure if the players on AFC Richmond, noticed that Ted was going to, Dr. Sharon on a regular basis and being willing to be open and vulnerable about what he has going on, obviously Isaac, had some stuff that he had to, contend with. Jamie, Roy, Colin, there were probably most of, if not all of the players on that team that had, their own troubles. Maybe Higgins might be the only person that was just actually, I'm good. I probably I'm stable. Nothing really to talk about here. But yeah. Just, I think it's helpful and truthful that when you see someone who is maybe in a position of authority who is just a mentor, so to say, I think that's a better way to put it. Someone that you can look up to who is still acknowledging that they need help. It makes you more willing to recognize, hey, if they can accept the fact that they might need some assistance as well, there's no shame in me coming to terms with that about myself either, and then seeking out that help that I might need. So just a lead by example sort of thing. I think it was very important and prevalent for them to showcase that people that you can look up to and really just admire and want to be can still have their own problems and things that they need help with. It doesn't make anyone lesser, but I think it's good to showcase that because, again, you just need to always recognize that no one's above that or better than that, but it certainly doesn't make you lesser either.
Yeah, I love the moment that Ted goes to the team after his panic attack was revealed, and he says, like, I'm sorry that I didn't tell you guys and that you had to find out this way, you know? Every choice, like every chance is a choice, I think is something he says. And it's just like, I had the choice to, to be open with you, and I didn't take it, and I lost a chance to build trust with you. And, I'm sorry about that. I won't do it again. Like, I'm here, I'm an open book, and I hope you guys won't hold anything back from me either. So he uses this as a learning experience and also a chance to deepen his relationship with the team and to encourage them to be open with him and to not hide their problems away and try to deal with them alone, but to bring them to the group. Ted is very much so about like bringing stuff to the group, and that's why we have the Diamond Dogs. Just in general, I think that whole idea is great. And there are so many great little like quotes peppered throughout about anger and pain and suffering and all of these things. And like I've got one here. When Beard says that he learned something in Codependence Anonymous because Jane makes him go. And he's like, pain is like carbon monoxide, and expressing your pain to the person who hurt you is like opening a vent. If you hold it in, it will kill you. And I just thought that was so perfect. Like, it just encapsulates everything that the show is trying to get at. Like even Nate says to Roy at Everton, like, your true superpower is anger, and I'm afraid if you hold it in, it'll kill you. Just, this idea of not holding everything inside, letting that emotion out, whether it's anger or pain or hatred or fear or whatever that is, holding it inside is what's hurting you. And that's where a lot of Ted's issues come from, is that sort of like the positivity as a sword and shield against those difficult emotions. And, it's helped him, and it's helped a lot of other people too, but there's a point where that stops being the case, and you can't hide everything under that kind of like just like facade of positivity all the time. And that's the big important lesson for Ted.
Yeah. And it's true that repressed emotion will kill you, or that was poor phrasing, but it will have really negative and detrimental effects. And we see that in Gilmore a lot. When Lorelai loses her father, she has always had a lot of repressed emotion about her relationship with her parents, and it comes out in the backyard when Emily is just asking for stories about Richard, and she gives one that is a little bit distasteful for the moment and certainly off color and not what Emily was expecting, but it was because she had bottled in so much over the decades with how she truly felt, and it came out in the worst way at the worst time. It's just one example of many where I think, again, in Gilmore, Lorelai, Rory, a lot of our characters just never really spoke up about how they were feeling. And
it's a perfect comparison. Yeah.
Yeah. That's it.
Yeah. All right. We've been going for over an hour, so I feel like we should speed round a couple because I still have like a bunch on this list. We've had too much good conversation, and that's what we're here for. I didn't have a huge like plan for structure for this one, so we're just riffing. But so I'm just gonna like go bit by bit, I guess, and like you can kick in if like interrupt me. I'll pitch it to you every so often to like give your thoughts or like your own examples from the list. A major point of similarity, I think, is that they're both comfort shows. They're both really wholesome and very relatable, and that's a big part of what keeps people coming back to them.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, this is a show where I've only seen it through, like Ted Lasso, obviously. I've only seen it through twice in its entirety now. But there are so many moments that I would just be, watching the episodes, and it's like, it's heartwarming and it brings a smile to your face. And just, sometimes if you've had a rough day at work or just, things have been hard, it's just a good way to decompress from that. Both shows do it very, very well, and I appreciate the positivity that they both bring.
Yeah, very much like a feel-good kind of show. Both have a heightened and fantastical version of reality where the absurd fits right in, and it's self-aware about that. You know, like an American football coach would never be hired for an English Premier League team because it's preposterous. That would never happen. Not even if a vindictive ex-wife wants to screw over her ex-husband who loves that team. Like, it just, these clubs are way too valuable to destroy them like that. And so like that would never happen. But Richmond is a very real place. And, you know, I've been there now, and it's wonderful. And I, watching the show back recently, I'm just like, oh my God, I've been there. And like, walked past that and stuff like that. It's fun. Whereas Stars Hollow is a fake place with very real feeling, sort of people. You know, like they both have these sort of like this would never actually happen or exist, but it feels real enough that we can still connect to it. And it's just sort of like that one level above reality into surreality, where it's like, I don't even care if it's not perfectly realistic. These elements are just so fun. And it's just so absurd. This would never actually happen. They would never do, well, I can't say they would never do musical numbers for their gaffer at a Premier League club. I mean, some people are kooky like that. But, you know, the premise of both shows is just sort of like fantastical communities, although the framing is very different, like different settings, different framing devices, and obviously very different inciting incidents.
Yeah, but I think that's why sometimes, you know, it is good for us to fall back on, and why we fall back on it, because, you know, it's nice to even recognize that places like that can exist if we don't have them in our day to day, and that's not a reality for us. Sometimes it's just nice and it's wholesome to see on TV, just knowing that that may not be your experience, but it's the experience for somebody. You know, and that as fantastical as Stars Hollow may be, as fantastical as, you know, the whole concept of, again, the AFC Richmond environment might be in terms of Americans coming over and just taking on these like leadership positions. It's, I think, the feel good that we're drawn to and that we need at the end of the day.
Yeah. I mean, nothing, sometimes if something's too realistic, it's not as feel good, right? That slight level of disconnect there's something heartwarming about it. Mm-hmm. They're both very rewatchable.
Oh yeah.
Like they're the kind of show where each time you watch, you pick up a new quote or a new reference or a new connection, and that makes it very satisfying to watch and rewatch.
Yeah. I, you know, cannot call to mind as easily, you know, quotes from Ted Lasso yet that I could from Gigi. But yeah, there's a lot of really good gems in there. I almost like, I appreciate Ted Lasso being a little more colorful with their language, you know, in terms of those quotes and in terms of the content. You know, and that's why I think sometimes, depending maybe on how you're feeling, it's like sometimes I just need, you know, family friendly stuff. And sometimes I just need, you know, someone to just like tell me to go F off at the end of the day. Like, you know,
yeah,
pick your poison, but both are really going to be helpful in there for you when you need them.
Yeah. Again, I'm a bit of a potty mouth in real life. And I also think that one of the most memorable quotes from at least the Gilmore revival was bullshit. And, you know, to me, that's sort of like the equivalent of Roy's fuck. You know, just that sort of like that epiphanal moment where it's like, profanity is required here.
Put a quarter in the swear jar, pay Phoebe.
Give Phoebe her pound.
Yep.
I love during Uncle's Day when Phoebe gives Roy that tie-dye shirt and Jamie swears and Phoebe just puts out her hand and he gives her a pound coin or a couple coins to like equal a pound. He's like, worth it. Yeah. He knows about the whole like paying her for swearing thing, and she just like hand out. So great. And you know, on that sort of note of rewatchability and references and stuff, quick-paced dialogue, very clever, very pop culture reference laden. Clearly, the writers are huge fans of musical theater and movies, especially rom-coms. Gilmore doesn't actually lean as much into the rom-coms as Ted Lasso does, which is, it's an interesting flip that I was thinking about earlier, where it's just like, you know, the show centering women actually has a range of pop culture references that isn't exclusively feminine. You know, they're not constantly referencing When Harry Met Sally or You've Got Mail or Bridget Jones's Diary. You know, they're referencing The Godfather and old black and white movies, His Girl Friday, like all of these other things. And so I love that this show that's aimed at kind of dismantling toxic masculinity is like, hey, we're going to make this group of grown men watch You've Got Mail and have them all bawling on the starting lineup in their final game of the season. Like, clutch. That was excellent. Gilmore would never touch that.
Or even doing things like it's movie night and they watch a movie about like an animated robot and they're just weeping by the end of it.
They all like bawl their eyes out at Iron Giant. Like, come on. And so like there are just so many great parallels and quotes that lean on references to other existing properties. We'll talk more about that in part 2, but just obviously had to throw that in there. What else is on the list? There's not really like a villain of Gilmore Girls. Like Emily kind of acts as a villain and is sort of similar to Rupert. I made this point when we talked about Ted Lasso in our masculinity episode. Go back and watch that if you haven't, because I go off on Ted Lasso for like 10 minutes and it's great. Get more of my thoughts there. One of the reasons that Emily sort of remains a villain, even when she has moments of humanity, is her resistance to change. You know, like, sorry, I've got like a frog in my throat, but Ted Lasso's characters grow and change, and they end up in better places and happier at the end because of that. Rupert is the main exception to that. So smaller villains come and go, but everybody has their moments of self-reflection and progression. Rupert does not. He suffers a major fall from grace because of his unwillingness to do that. And I think Emily is very much the same, where she's just so stuck in her own ways that she'll like, well, I guess she kind of changes by the end of the revival and loosens up a little bit. But like through the main series, especially, the reason that she sort of remains this antagonistic figure is she doesn't take in any new information and use it to adapt her behaviors in any way. You know, like when Rory moves in with them, she just treats her like she did Lorelai and expects a different result because it's a different person. But in reality, it's her approach that's the problem. Ted Lasso does not do that, you know?
Yeah, I will say, even if it's minute and small, I do think it's there. And I do think that Emily does have growth by the end of the show and by the end of the revival. We never get that with Rupert whatsoever. And I feel like that man is just, you know, doomed to be so set in his ways. And he's not going to grow because I don't think he recognizes that there, like in his mind, there's nothing wrong with him. There's nothing that he needs to better himself about. Like he's fine as he is. There's never going to be that self-awareness or introspection there. And Emily wasn't great at that either, but I feel like she was just a little more cognizant to the pain that she had caused Lorelai in her life, the pain that she had caused family members. And with Rupert, he was never going to acknowledge that he had done harm to anybody else.
Yeah, it's true. A large ensemble cast of distinct and lovable characters. Both do a pretty good job with this, frankly. You know, everybody is memorable and has their own background and their own quirks. But I actually think Ted Lasso still does it better because we got, I think, even more information and understanding about different characters, even if they're only based roughly on like cultural stereotypes. Like Richard being hypersexualized as a French man, stuff like that. But, you know, like at least we know where these people are from and kind of what they're into and all that. And some side characters you wouldn't expect get really great arcs in the end, like Colin, which we'll probably get to in the next episode because we're running short on time here. But, you know, Gilmore will give good storylines to side characters. Yeah. And just, you know, the management of ensembles and the interactions with them is strong on both shows. But I, again, think Ted Lasso did it better.
I don't know. I mean, I'm not going to say that Gilmore Girls did it better, but I would call it a tie, I think, on
Maybe.
that one.
They're almost just so different that you can't say who wins, because you have a town versus a team, and the dynamic by nature has to be very different. And so that brings out different aspects of the use of an ensemble cast in the first place. So
yeah, I mean, I'll say, to back up my tie, the entire town coming together for Lorelai at the end of the show, and equivocally for Rory, but just to see what they did at the end of it, for both of our Gilmore women. Again, tie. Like, when do you get a moment like that?
Yeah. And, this one's just like a small point that really doesn't warrant much further discussion, but like the fact that Ted Lasso it's obviously not one-to-one, but Ted Lasso kind of does what Gilmore Girls does, but with fathers and sons instead of mothers and daughters. And it very much focuses on parental relationships, but also like mentorship or connections between people in that sort of way, where it's like, Roy is obviously not Jamie's dad, but he acts very much in sort of a fatherly capacity, especially after we figure out that that Jamie's dad is, what's it? His mom calls him a human ball sack. So apologies for the fruity language, but yeah, like there's a lot of emphasis on fathers and sons and the roles of good dads and bad dads, in a very similar vein to the emphasis on Lorelai's relationship to both her mother and her daughter. And, Suki as a mom, and Lane as a mom, and Mrs. Kim, and, all of these mother relationships, these maternal caring figures. Ted Lasso sort of takes that idea for fathers, but gives those fathers a lot more like variety and depth, because we had an entire episode on how Gilmore Girls messed up fatherhood, I think. Like they just really underperformed with the dads on the show, whereas a lot of the dads in Ted Lasso are exemplary.
Yeah, I agree. Just how men are seen in general. Much more realistic, truthful, and healthy on Ted Lasso. I could go off on how that wasn't good on Gilmore Girls, but I'm not going to, because we've already talked about it and we're out of time anyway.
Exactly. Last couple parallels. Okay, so both of them feature a journalist who like leaves a newspaper to write a book.
Mm-hmm.
A book about the show.
One with consent.
Yeah. One with, hey, I was not hired, but like I was explicitly given permission to have access to the club as much as I want, and for interviews and pitch side access, all that. Yeah, that's an interesting one. And then the last one, which is fitting enough, is that both focus very strongly on internal parallels and coming full circle. But again, Ted Lasso does it better. Amy does it in such a way, at least in my opinion, where, again, I said it earlier, spinning the wheels. It's like you can't escape a generational curse. Whereas Ted Lasso is very much about like being better than the previous generation and learning from them, but doing better and coming full circle in your own life as well.
Yeah. And I think that is a really good place to wind us up for this one on.
I have two more quick ones that are differences.
Okay, differences. Okay.
Ted Lasso actually did a freaking queer storyline. Thank you. Wasn't the best. Wasn't terrible. Could have been better. But they actually did it. They touched it. They ventured that. Whereas Gilmore couldn't really, but even by the revival, when it would have been much more acceptable, the best they gave us was like, yeah, Michelle actually is gay. Congratulations.
And just how about that? The briefest of hints to Taylor.
Yeah, in the Pride Parade stuff. Like that was all we got. Whereas here we had like the focus in season 3 on Keely and Jack, which we'll probably get to in the next part. And then the very last one is just sort of like the structural difference between the shows, in the sense that Ted Lasso exists in an era of streaming television where they're given a lot of flexibility by the network, especially after the success of season 1. They were really able to run with that. They knew they wanted that like 3-act structure. It was always kind of intended for this story to be 3 parts, 3 seasons. And even though the episode lengths varied and the seasons got longer as they went on, they stuck to that. Whereas Gilmore Girls was network and they had a lot of restrictions and whatnot. And so it was just like, oh, we did well again, let's order a season or 2. We did well again, let's order a season or 2. And Amy wanted to go to 8 seasons. And so you get this, like, you know, you don't need 8 seasons for characters to develop and for rhythms to be established and rituals to be established and for like room to breathe or for world building. Ted Lasso accomplishes that very efficiently in 3 seasons. Like, I think they cram more character growth, development, and like human emotion into 3 seasons than Gilmore did into 8 or like 7 in a revival, right?
I would concur. Doesn't mean we're ever going to stop loving Gilmore Girls. We are certainly not. That will always be one of our shows. You know, but part of loving a show is being able to critique it and, you know, just recognizing when it does not do well or does not do as well as another show, which is what we have tried to highlight here and what we will continue to extrapolate on in part 2.
Yeah, it's not a bad thing that Gilmore is long. It's not a critique against it. It was a very different context and all of that. But I think, you know, the intervening years and the timing of everything is interesting to look at in terms of why one might be doing a better job than the others or the other, because we're learning from it. You know, show writers are learning what satisfying storytelling is to people now, and it's different than what it was then. So take that with what you will. Again, we're a Gilmore Girls podcast. We're clearly here because we love it. But sometimes holding it up against something else or something newer can illuminate problems with the old and make us more like critically aware of these things. And I think that's a good thing. You know, it doesn't diminish my love for Gilmore that Ted Lasso can outclass it in some areas.
Yep. Nor should it. But we'll always be here again, week after week, for the most part, talking about, you know, one of our favorite shows of all time. We'll continue on with this Ted Lasso discussion further next week. We will have a part 2. In the meantime, we hope that you have enjoyed this iteration and part 1 of our conversation, just, you know, juxtapositioning these 2 shows. Come back and join us next week. And in the meantime, go back and watch some of our old videos if you just want more GG content. Watch Ted Lasso if you have not already, because it is a phenomenal show, and I will just thank you endlessly for turning me on to it. And as always, please just remember to do those YouTube things for us. Please like this video, subscribe to our channel, 1 click, and we really do appreciate all of that support that you continue to give us and show us week after week. Other than that, we're going to end this one here, and we will see you next Friday night for dinner.
Bye.
Bye.